The call came on a Tuesday, the kind of crisp autumn afternoon where the sunlight is so golden and pure it almost feels like a lie. I was in the garden, my hands buried in the cool, dark soil, trying to coax the last of the summer roses back to life, when my phone vibrated against the porch step. It was David's brother, Mark, and his voice was a thin, broken thread. "Nancy," he said. And in that one word, my entire world, the whole carefully constructed life I'd built over 62 years, simply shattered. David was gone. A massive heart attack, they said, right there at his desk. No goodbye, no last kiss, no final, quiet smile, just silence. The drive to the city was a blur of gray highway and a screaming inside my head that was so loud I was surprised the other drivers couldn't hear it. My David, my steady, quiet David who still held my hand in the movies, gone. I called our sons. I had to pull over to do it, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. Michael, my eldest, answered on the third ring. There was music thumping in the background, a deep bass line I could feel in my own teeth. "Mom, hey, what's up?" he said, his voice cheerful, distracted. I took a breath that felt like shards of glass. "Michael, it's your dad." The pause was so short I almost missed it. "What about him?" I could hear a woman's laughter, then Michael's muffled voice saying, "Hey babe, get me another one, will ya?" He came back on the line. "Sorry, Mom, we're just setting up for the party. What's going on?" "Michael," I whispered, the word tearing out of me. "He's gone. Your father. He died this afternoon." The silence that followed was different this time. Thicker. I could almost hear the calculations happening 1,000 miles away. "Oh. Wow. Okay. That's really something." There was no sob, no gasp of disbelief, just a dull acceptance that felt like a physical blow. "I'm on my way to the funeral home now. I'll call you with the details." "Yeah, sure. Mom, okay. Listen, I'll talk to you later." And he was gone. The line went dead, leaving me alone with the echo of that party and the crushing weight of my new reality. I called Robert next. His phone went straight to voicemail. I didn't have the strength to leave a message. I just sat there on the shoulder of the road, watching the cars whip past, each one full of people whose lives hadn't ended in the last 10 minutes. The next few days were a nightmare, painted in shades of gray. The funeral director, a kind man named Mr. Henderson, spoke in a hushed, practiced tone. I picked out a casket, a simple, elegant walnut box because David was never one for flash. I chose his suit, the navy blue one he wore to our son's weddings, and I held it against my face, breathing in the faint, ghostly scent of his cologne that still clung to the wool. All the while, my phone remained stubbornly, deafeningly silent. Michael called once to say he and Robert would be flying in the night before the service. "No, how are you holding up, Mom? No, I'm so sorry." It was a transaction, a logistical update. The hurt was a cold, hard stone in my chest, right next to the gaping hole David had left behind. The morning of the funeral dawned bleak and rainy, as if the sky itself was mourning the man my sons couldn't be bothered to. The church was filled with faces from our past, neighbors from 30 years ago, colleagues from the firm, David's old golf buddies with their eyes red-rimmed and their hands shaking as they clasped mine. But the two front pews, the ones reserved for family, were achingly empty. My sister Carol sat with me, her arm tight around my shoulders, a silent fortress of support. "They'll be here," she whispered, but even her faith sounded thin. 10 minutes before the service was to begin, the heavy oak door at the back of the church creaked open. Michael and Robert slipped in, dressed in suits that looked new, bought for the occasion. They didn't come to the front. They sat in the very last pew. I turned to look at them, my heart a frantic bird in my chest, hoping for a glimpse of grief, of shared loss, of my boys. Michael met my gaze for a second, then looked down at his phone, his thumb scrolling. Robert gave a tight, small nod. And that was it. I turned back around, the cold stone of hurt in my chest turning to searing hot betrayal. I buried their father through a veil of tears I could no longer control, my sobs the only sound echoing in the quiet church, while my sons sat in the back row, strangers at their own father's funeral. After the final prayer, as people began to file out, offering their soft condolences, I saw them leave. They didn't come to speak to me. They just left. I went home to our empty, silent house. Carol had organized a small gathering, but I begged off, the need to be alone a physical ache. I sat in David's armchair, clutching the throw pillow he always used, and I cried until I had no tears left. Hours later, driven by a morbid, painful curiosity, I did what I knew I shouldn't. I picked up my phone. I opened the social media app I barely knew how to use, the one my sons had insisted I join to see pictures of their lives. And there it was. A post from Michael, time-stamped just an hour ago. A video. I pressed play. The scene was a brightly lit rooftop bar, all strung-up lights and a glittering city skyline. And there they were. Michael and Robert, drinks in hand, their ties loosened, laughing. The camera panned to a small group of their friends, and then the music swelled, and they all started dancing, a careless, joyful swaying to a pulsing beat. Michael's caption was like a knife to the heart. Life is for the living. Cheers to good times with the best brother a guy could ask for. Hashtag family first, new beginnings. I stared at the screen, my breath caught in my throat. They were dancing. They were dancing, laughing, toasting to new beginnings while the dirt on their father's grave was still fresh, while I was sitting in the profound silence of a house that had lost its soul. The pain was so immense, it was almost peaceful. It hollowed me out, and in that hollowed-out space, a resolve, cold and sharp and clear, began to form. I had spent a lifetime making excuses for them, forgiving their thoughtlessness, their self-absorption. But this was a final, unforgivable severance. They had shown me who they were, and finally, after 62 years, I believed them. I picked up my phone, my fingers now perfectly steady, and I opened my banking app. For 30 years, David and I had scrimped and saved. We had a trust, a sizable one, meant to be our legacy, a safety net for our boys and their future families. It was the one thing we were truly proud of building together. With a few taps, I accessed the account. I looked at the balance, a number that represented a lifetime of love and labor. And then I started changing the details. I was no longer just a grieving widow. I was a woman wronged, and it was time to rewrite the ending. The cursor blinked over the beneficiary form, a tiny, relentless metronome, counting down to a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. The money had always been for them. It was the unspoken promise David and I made over lukewarm coffee at our Formica kitchen table, watching them play in the backyard. It was for college, for their first homes, for a cushion when life, as it always does, threw something hard their way. But as I stared at their names, Michael James Miller and Robert Elias Miller, they were just words now. They didn't represent the chubby-cheeked boys who built forts with couch cushions or the teenagers who needed help with their algebra homework. They represented the two men in the back of the church, the two faces laughing on a rooftop while their father's soul was barely cold. My finger hovered over the remove button next to Michael's name. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, flashed behind my eyes. Michael, age 7, with a gap-toothed grin, handing me a dandelion bouquet. "For you, Mommy, 'cause you're the prettiest." I clicked remove. A confirmation box popped up. "Are you sure?" the screen asked me. No, I was not sure. I was a woman unmoored, acting on a pain so profound it had become a kind of madness. But the video, that awful, cheerful video, played on a loop in my mind. I clicked confirm. One down. I moved to Robert's name. My baby. My sensitive Robert, who cried at sad movies and who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms, his small body trusting and warm between David and me. Where was that boy now? He had stood by and let this happen. He had been a silent accomplice to this ultimate betrayal. I removed his name too. The screen refreshed. The beneficiary field was blank. A hollow emptiness echoed in the pit of my stomach. What was I doing? This was their inheritance, David's legacy. But another voice, colder and clearer, whispered that a legacy meant nothing to men who had no respect for its origin. A legacy was for family, and they had made it abundantly clear that I was no longer part of theirs. I couldn't just leave it empty. The money needed a purpose, a direction that would have made David's hard work mean something. I thought of the community college downtown, the one where David had taught a night class in accounting for years, for free, because he believed in second chances and the dignity of a good education. I navigated to their website, found the information for their endowment fund, and began typing. I transferred half, a sizable, transformative donation in the name of David Miller. It felt right. It felt like him. The other half? That was for me. For the woman who had spent 40 years putting everyone else first. For the wife who was now alone. I set up a transfer into my own personal savings account, a nest egg that was mine and mine alone. It wasn't about the money. It was about agency. It was about choice. As I finalized the transactions, a strange calm settled over me. The screaming grief was still there, but it was now joined by a steely resolve. The phone in my hand, which had been a conduit of such searing pain, now felt like a tool of liberation. I placed it back on the side table and looked around the quiet living room. The silence was different now. It wasn't just empty. It was waiting. I knew it wasn't over. They would find out. When the time came, when they finally deigned to remember their father had left them something, they would find out. The storm that would follow was a certainty, a dark cloud on my horizon. But for the first time since that terrible Tuesday, I felt like I could face it. I had taken my first breath in a new world, a world without David, a world where the love for my sons had been cauterized by their own hands. And I had just drawn a line in the sand. The silence in the house lasted exactly 3 days. It was a brittle, fragile peace, punctuated only by the ticking of the grandfather clock David had lovingly restored, and the hollow sound of my own footsteps. I spent those days in a sort of suspended animation, moving from room to room, not cleaning, not really eating, just existing in the spaces he had once filled. I slept in his armchair, wrapped in his old cardigan, because the emptiness of our bed was a vast, cold ocean I couldn't bring myself to enter. The fourth day, a Friday, the phone rang. The caller ID flashed Michael. I watched it ring, my heart hammering against my ribs, a chaotic, frightened rhythm. 4 rings. 5. On the 6th, I picked it up. I didn't speak. I just held the receiver to my ear, listening to the staticky silence on the other end. "Mom?" His voice was sharp, edged with an irritation that was so familiar it was like a punch to the gut. "Yeah, Michael." My own voice sounded foreign, raspy from disuse. "Look, we need to talk about the trust. Robert and I have been discussing things, and we think it's time we started looking at our options for the future." He didn't ask how I was. He didn't mention his father. He launched straight into the business of inheritance. his tone that of a CEO discussing a quarterly report. The cold stone in my chest, the one that had formed at the funeral, turned to ice. "What options, Michael?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "Well, the money, Mom. Dad's money. We're not kids anymore. I've got a potential business venture I'm looking at, and Robert, well, he could use a down payment on a decent place. That condo of his is a shoebox." I could hear Robert muttering something in the background, a nervous, agreeing sound. They were together. Of course they were. Planning how to spend the money their father had worked his whole life for, the money they felt entitled to without having offered a single moment of comfort to the widow he'd left behind. "I see," I said softly. "So you've got it all figured out." "We're just being practical," Michael said, his tone softening into a patronizing mimicry of warmth. "We know you're not thinking about these things right now, Mom. You're grieving. Let us handle it. We can have the lawyer drop the papers. You just sign. We'll take care of everything." Take care of everything. The phrase echoed in the hollow space where my heart used to be. They hadn't taken care of the funeral. They hadn't taken care of me. They wanted to take care of the money. "There's no need for papers, Michael," I said. The line was so quiet I could hear his breath. "What do you mean?" "The trust," I said, each word clear and precise, like a drop of water falling into a still pond. "I've dissolved it." The silence on the other end was absolute, a vacuum. Then a disbelieving laugh. "What? Mom, don't be ridiculous. You can't just dissolve it. That's our money." "It was your father's money," I corrected him, a sudden sharp anger giving my voice strength. "And mine. And I have done exactly that." "What did you do with it?" This was Robert, his voice shrill, cutting in on the line. The nervousness was gone, replaced by a panicked greed. Did you move it? Mom, you can't just make decisions like that on your own. We're his sons." "I am his wife." The words erupted from me, a raw, wounded cry that had been building for days. I was the one who held his hand when he talked about his fears. I was the one who made his coffee every morning for 42 years. I was the one who sat in that church alone, burying the best man I have ever known, while his sons were dancing. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and accusatory. The line went dead quiet again. They had seen the video. They knew I knew. For a moment, I thought I heard a sliver of shame in that silence. I was wrong. "So that's what this is about?" Michael's voice was cold, hard, stripped of all pretense. "You're throwing a tantrum because you saw a video? We were grieving in our own way, Mom. You don't get to monopolize grief." "Grieving?" I whispered, the absurdity of it stealing my breath. "Is that what you call it?" "We're coming down there," Michael said, his voice dropping into a low, threatening register I had never heard him from before. "We're getting on a plane right now. You are not going to screw us out of what is rightfully ours. You will not rob us of our father's legacy." And with that, he hung up. The dial tone buzzed in my ear, a harsh, modern sound in my quiet old house. I slowly placed the phone back in its cradle. My hands were trembling, but my mind was clearer than it had been in weeks. The line had been drawn, and they had just charged right over it. They were coming. My sons were coming to war with their mother over money. I looked around the living room, at the photographs on the mantel, their gap-toothed school pictures, our family vacation at the beach, our wedding portrait. The faces in those frames were strangers to me now. I stood up, David's cardigan falling from my shoulders. The time for sleeping in chairs was over. The quiet of the house was now a loaded thing, a calm before a storm I had just been warned was coming. I could almost hear the echo of Michael's threat in the air, a vibration of pure entitlement that felt so alien in the home where we had raised them to be grateful, to be kind. I walked to the mantel and picked up our wedding portrait. David's face, so young, so full of a hopeful, certain love, stared back at me. "What happened to our boys, David?" I whispered to the glass. "Where did we go wrong?" The photo offered no answers, only the ghost of a happiness that now felt like a precursor to this profound, specific heartbreak. I knew I couldn't just wait for them to arrive, for the confrontation to happen on their terms, in the space David and I had built together. This house was a sanctuary, the last place we had been a family, and I would not let them defile it with their anger and their greed. I had to move. Not out, no, but I had to fortify. My first call was to Carol. I didn't have to explain much. She had been there. She had seen the empty pews. "They're coming, Carol," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "They're angry about the money." "Oh, honey," she breathed, and I could hear the immediate, fierce loyalty in her tone. "Do you want me to come over? I'll bring my rolling pin. I haven't clobbered a fool since the 7th grade, but I reckon it's like riding a bike." A small, real smile touched my lips for the first time in days. "No rolling pin, but could you come? I shouldn't be alone when they get here." "I'm on my way," she said, and the line went dead. Next, I called Mr. Henderson, the funeral director. It was an unusual call to make, but he had been so kind, so steady. He was a man who understood the logistics of death, and right now my life was mired in them. I asked him if he could recommend a lawyer, someone who specialized in estates and wasn't afraid of a messy, emotional family dispute. He didn't ask questions, he just gave me a name and number. Eleanor Vance. "She's a pit bull in a pearls. She'll take good care of you." I called Eleanor Vance immediately. Her secretary put me right through. I told her the story in a clipped, efficient monotone, leaving out the raw emotion and focusing on the facts. The death, the funeral, the disillusion of the trust, the impending confrontation. She listened without interruption. When I was finished, she simply said, "I'll be at your house in 1 hour. Do not speak to your sons until I arrive. Do not let them in. Is that clear?" It was. The clarity was a lifeline. By the time Carol arrived, bearing a casserole she'd undoubtedly been saving for a more traditional occasion, I had a plan. Or at least, I had a defender. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped the boys with countless science projects, and I told her everything. The phone call, the threats, the cold, hard reality of it all. Carol listened, her hand covering mine, her eyes growing wider and fiercer with every word. "They have no right," she finally said, her voice trembling with an anger I was too numb to feel. "After how they behaved, Nancy, they forfeited their right the moment they chose that rooftop over their own father's grave." The doorbell rang. It wasn't a friendly chime, it was a long, insistent press, a demand. Carol and I looked at each other. Through the frosted glass of the front door, I could see 2 tall, broad-shouldered silhouettes. They were here. Already. They must have caught the first flight out. "Don't you answer that," Carol said, standing up, her posture ramrod straight. "Let them stand there." The bell rang again, followed by a sharp, impatient knock. "Mom, we know you're in there. Open the door." Michael's voice, muffled but clear, boomed through the wood. I stood up. My legs felt weak, but my resolve did not. I walked to the door, Carol a step behind me, a silent sentinel. I didn't open it. I stood to the side and spoke through the glass. "You need to leave, Michael." There was a beat of stunned silence. He hadn't expected resistance. "Mom, open this door right now. We are not leaving until we talk about this like adults." "There was nothing to talk about," I said, my voice low but carrying. "The decision is made." "Like hell it is." This was Robert, his voice cracking with a mix of panic and fury. "You stole from us. That was our money. Dad would be sick if he knew what you were doing." The mention of David, used as a weapon against me, broke the last of my restraint. I unlocked the door and pulled it open, just a crack, the chain lock still firmly in place. I saw their faces, flushed and angry, distorted by the narrow slice of the opening. They looked like strangers.
Your father, I said, my voice shaking with a lifetime of love and a week of hell, would be heartbroken. But not by me, by you. Now get off my porch. I went to close the door, but Michael shoved his foot in the jamb, blocking it. This isn't over, Mom. Just then, a sleek silver sedan pulled into the driveway. A woman in a sharp navy blue suit got out, a leather briefcase in one hand. Eleanor Vance had arrived. She walked up the path as if she owned it, her heels clicking a confident rhythm on the pavement. She looked at my sons, at Michael's foot in the door, and her expression was one of cool, professional disdain. I suggest you remove your foot from the door, Mr. Miller, she said, her voice calm, but leaving no room for argument. Before I advise my client to call the police and have you charged with trespassing and attempted breaking and entering. The shock on their faces was almost comical. They hadn't expected a lawyer. They had expected their mother, alone and vulnerable, someone they could bully into submission. Michael slowly pulled his foot back. Eleanor gave them a thin, frosty smile. Good. Now, if you have any further communications regarding your mother's financial or legal matters, you will direct them to my office. She handed a business card through the crack in the door. Robert snatched it from her hand. He looked from her to me, his eyes wide with a kind of betrayed fury. You brought a lawyer against your own sons? He whispered, the words dripping with venom. I looked at him. My baby boy. And I felt the last tiny thread of hope snap. No, I said, softly, just before I closed the door and locked it. My sons are gone. I turned my back on the door, on them, and faced Carol and Eleanor Vance. The fight, I knew, was far from over, but the first battle was won. I had held the line.
The deadbolt clicked into place with a finality that echoed through the silent house, a sound more definitive than any spoken word. For a moment, there was only the sound of our breathing. Carol's a little shaky, mine shallow and ragged, Eleanor's perfectly even. Then, from the other side of the door, came a low, guttural curse from Michael, followed by the sound of a fist hitting the wooden frame. The whole door shuddered. Carol flinched, but Eleanor Vance didn't even blink. She simply placed her briefcase on the small entryway table as if she were settling into her own office. They'll likely linger for a few minutes, hoping to intimidate you into reopening the door, she said, her voice clinical. But they will leave. They've been presented with a boundary and a consequence. Men like that understand little else. Men like that. The phrase hung in the air, painting a portrait of my children that was both accurate and devastating. I leaned against the wall, suddenly drained, the adrenaline that had fueled me seeping away to leave a profound, bone-deep weariness. Carol put the kettle on, the familiar, comforting ritual of clinking china and hissing steam a stark contrast to the violence that had just vibrated through our home. We moved to the living room, the three of us, and I told Eleanor everything, from the first phone call on that Golden Tuesday to the social media video that had broken me. I showed it to her on my phone. She watched it, her expression unchanging, a perfect mask of professional detachment. When it ended, she placed the phone face down on the coffee table. The video is distasteful but not legally relevant, she stated. Their behavior, however abhorrent, does not legally invalidate their claim to an inheritance if one existed. The fact that you were the sole trustee and grantor of the revocable trust is what is relevant. You had every legal right to dissolve it. They have no legal standing to challenge that decision. She took a sip of the tea Carol handed her. What they will try to do is challenge your mental capacity. They will argue that you are not of sound mind due to grief, that you were coerced, or that you are suffering from undue influence. She glanced at Carol. From a third party. Carol's eyes widened. Me? They'll think I put her up to this? It's a common tactic, Eleanor said. They will look for a villain, anyone but themselves. They will also, almost certainly, try to gain access to the house. Why? I asked, confused. To look for documents, she explained. A copy of the old trust, financial statements, anything they can use to build a case. Or, more likely, to intimidate you. They will use your shared history, your motherhood, against you. They will try to make you feel guilty,
unstable, and cruel. She looked at me directly, her gaze unwavering. You cannot let them in, Nancy. Not for a minute, not for a cup of coffee, not to use the bathroom. This is no longer your home. It is a legal asset, and they are now potential adversaries in a litigation. The word adversaries landed like a physical weight on my chest. I looked around the room, at the worn spot on the rug where David's feet had rested every evening, at the faint crayon mark on the baseboard Robert had made when he was 5, a mark I could never bring myself to wash away. This place was a museum of our life, and she was telling me it was now a battlefield. What do I do? I whispered. You let me handle them, Eleanor said. I will send them a formal letter outlining the situation and informing them that all communication must go through me. You, however, need to do something for yourself. You need to see your doctor. I'm not sick, though I felt utterly ill. It's not for sickness, it's for a checkup. We need a contemporaneous medical record stating that you are alert, oriented, and fully capable of managing your own affairs. It is a preemptive strike.
When they inevitably claim you've lost your mind, we will have a doctor's report, dated from this week, that says otherwise. It was so cold, so calculated. It was also brilliant. I nodded slowly, the reality of this new war settling over me. This wasn't a family disagreement. It was a legal and psychological siege. After Eleanor left with promises to draft the letter immediately, Carol and I sat in the lingering quiet. The house felt different. Eleanor's presence had charged it with a new, grim purpose. I had drawn a line in the sand, and my sons had not only crossed it, they had tried to kick the sand in my face. Now, I was building a wall. She's right, you know, Carol said softly, breaking the long silence. About the doctor? We should go tomorrow. We'll make a day of it. Doctor in the morning, and then we'll get you a new phone. I looked at her, puzzled. A new phone? A new number, she clarified, her eyes gentle but firm. Nancy, you can't keep that thing. It's the number they have. It's the thing that rings with their calls. It's the device you use to see that video. It's an instrument of torture. You need to cut the cord. She was right. The phone felt like a vile, poisonous thing in my pocket, a direct line to the pain. The next morning, we did just that. The doctor, a kind woman named Dr. Evans, who'd seen me through menopause and David's first cancer scare, was thoroughly confused by my request for a cognitive assessment, but complied. She asked me the date, who was president, to count backwards from 100 by sevens. Nancy, you're one of the sharpest women I know, she said, signing the form with a flourish. Is everything all right? No, I said honestly, my voice thick. But it will be. Then Carol took me to the phone store. It was a surreal experience, standing under the bright fluorescent lights amidst buzzing teenagers, choosing a new device and a new number. It felt symbolic, like shedding an old, diseased skin. As the salesman transferred my contacts, Carol, a few close friends, my pharmacy, I realized with a jolt that Michael and Robert's numbers were not being carried over. They were being left behind in the old phone, in the old life. It was a small, silent severance. When we walked out of the store, the new phone in my purse felt clean, light. It belonged to me. It belonged to Nancy Miller. The widow, yes, but also to Nancy Miller, the woman who was starting over. We were walking back to Carol's car when my old number, still active in the old phone in my kitchen drawer, began to buzz. Carol, who was holding my purse, froze. We both looked at the screen of the new phone where my old number was listed as an incoming call. They were calling. Again. We stood there on the sunny sidewalk, people bustling past us with their normal, uncomplicated lives, and we listened as the old phone rang and rang and rang. A ghost from a life that was already gone. The ringing from my purse felt like a phantom limb, a persistent, painful echo of a connection that had been surgically severed. We stood frozen on the bustling sidewalk, the cheerful sounds of a normal afternoon a stark contrast to the internal silence that scream of the old phone created. It rang 15 times before finally going to voicemail, a moment of blessed quiet, and then it started again. This time, it was a specific, jarring ringtone I had assigned years ago, the opening chords of Sweet Child of Mine, Robert's song. He'd loved it since he was a toddler. My heart, that traitorous organ, clenched into a tight, painful fist. Carol's hand was on my arm, her grip firm. "Don't you dare, Nancy. Don't you even think about it." "I wasn't," I whispered, but it was a lie. For that 1 second, hearing that song, I was back in a minivan with a car full of sweaty Little League players. Robert in the passenger seat begging me to turn it up. The memory was a sweet poison. The phone stopped, then immediately started again with the generic ringtone, Michael. They were tag-teaming me, using the last weapon they had, the ghost of our shared history. "Give it to me," Carol said, her voice tight. She took my purse, fished out the old phone, and, without a moment's hesitation, she declined the call. Her thumb moved over the screen with a grim finality, and she powered the whole device down. The silence that followed was absolute and profound. "There," she said, placing the dead phone back in my purse. "It's over." But it wasn't. We both knew it. When we returned to my house, the air was different. It felt still, as if holding its breath. There were no more angry silhouettes on the porch, but their presence had been baked into the very wood of the front door. Carol insisted on staying the night, and I didn't argue. We ordered Chinese food and ate it on paper plates in the living room, as silent agreement that using the good china felt wrong, like a betrayal of the somber mood that had settled over the house. It was while we were cleaning up, the cartons of leftover lo mein and kung pao chicken sitting on the counter, that I saw it. A flicker of movement in the backyard. Dusk was settling, painting the world in shades of blue and gray. I peered out the kitchen window over the sink, my breath catching in my throat. It was Robert. He was standing by David's old shed, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his shoulders hunched against the cooling air. He wasn't looking at the house, he was just staring at the shed door, his posture one of such profound dejection that for a wild, heart-lurching moment, I thought he was here to apologize. Maybe he'd seen the error of his ways. Maybe the gravity of it all had finally crashed down on him. "Carol," I whispered, my voice trembling. She came to stand beside me, following my gaze. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she muttered, but her tone lacked its earlier fire. There was something uniquely pitiable about the scene. He looked like a lost little boy. He stood there for a full 5 minutes, not moving. Then he slowly turned and looked directly at the kitchen window. He couldn't possibly see us through the reflection of the indoor lights on the glass, but he seemed to be looking right at me. He raised a hand, not a wave, but a slow, hesitant gesture of, what? Supplication? Defeat? My mother's heart, the one that had soothed his nightmares and bandaged his scraped knees, broke all over again. I took an involuntary step toward the back door. Carol's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. "Nancy, no. Remember what Eleanor said." "But he looks so sad, Carol. What if he's sorry?" "If he was sorry, he'd have led with an apology, not a lawsuit," she said, her voice gentle but unyielding. "This is a tactic. He's the good cop to Michael's bad cop. They're trying to get to your soft heart because their hardball approach failed." I knew she was right. I knew it with every logical, battered fiber of my being. But watching my youngest child stand alone in the twilight, looking so broken, was a special kind of torture. He stood for another minute, his hand still half raised, before he finally let it drop.
He shoved his hands back in his pockets, turned and walked slowly around the side of the house, disappearing from view. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The backyard was empty again, but it was no longer peaceful. It was haunted. I spent the rest of the evening jumping at every small sound, my nerves stretched taut. I kept expecting another knock, another ring of the doorbell, another apparition at the window, but the house remained quiet. The siege, for the moment, had lifted. Later, as I tried and failed to sleep in my lonely bed, the image of Robert in the backyard played on a loop behind my eyelids. It was the look in his eyes, or what I imagined the look in his eyes to be. It wasn't the hot, greedy anger from the porch. It was a cold, deep sorrow. And that was so much worse, because anger I could fight. Anger fortified my resolve. But his sorrow called to my own, and it threatened to pull me under, to make me question every single decision I had made since the moment I picked up that phone and saw them dancing. I had wanted to hurt them, to make them feel a fraction of the pain they had caused me. Staring at the ceiling, listening to the empty silence of the house, I had to ask myself the terrible, haunting question: had I succeeded?
The memory of Robert's solitary figure in the twilight lingered like a stubborn stain on the fabric of the next day, casting a pall over the simple act of making coffee. I felt fractured, pulled in two by the warring instincts of a mother's unconditional love and a woman's hard-won self-respect. Carol had left early, promising to return by lunch, and the silence she left behind was a different creature now. It was watchful, waiting. I was pouring the steaming water into the French press when a sharp, official-sounding knock rattled the front door. It wasn't the angry pounding from my sons. This was percussive and efficient. My hand jerked, splashing hot water on the counter. Eleanor Vance's warning echoed in my mind. They will try to gain access. Had they sent someone? A constable? A social worker to do a wellness check? Heart thudding, I crept to the side window and peered through the slats of the blinds. A uniformed delivery man stood on the porch, holding a large, flat cardboard envelope and an electronic clipboard. He knocked again, a routine, disinterested sound. Relief, cold and swift, washed over me, followed immediately by a fresh wave of anxiety. I wasn't expecting anything. I unlocked the door, leaving the chain on, and opened it a few inches. "Nancy Miller?" the man asked, his voice bored. "I need a signature." "What is it?" "Legal documents, ma'am," he said, tapping the envelope. "From the law firm of Hartwell and Associates." The name meant nothing to me. My blood ran cold. Hartwell and Associates. It had to be their lawyers. Michael and Robert had made good on their threat faster than I could have imagined. With trembling fingers, I undid the chain and signed the screen he proffered. He handed me the envelope, gave a curt nod, and was back in his truck before I had even fully closed the door. I stood in the foyer, holding the package. It felt heavy, imbued with a malevolent weight. I carried it to the kitchen table, my breakfast forgotten. I just stared at it. This was it. The formal declaration of war. The end of any pretense that this was a family matter. It was now a case number, a file in a courthouse. The sound of a key in the lock made me jump. Carol bustled in, her arms full of grocery bags. I figured we could use some comfort food. I got the stuff for my famous lasagna and... Her cheerful patter died the moment she saw my face. Then the envelope on the table. "Oh, Nancy, no." "It came," I said, my voice hollow, "from Hartwell and Associates." Carol dropped the bags on the counter with a thud and came to stand beside me, putting a steadying arm around my shoulders. "Well, don't just let it sit there staring at you. Open it. Let's see what we're dealing with." I took a steak knife from the block and sliced the envelope open with a single sharp motion. Inside was a thick sheaf of papers. The cover letter was stiff, formal, and addressed to me. It was from an attorney named Dennis Albright,
representing Michael and Robert Miller. My eyes scanned the dense, legalistic text, picking out phrases that jumped out like shards of glass. Deeply concerned for your well-being and mental state following the tragic passing of your husband. Evidence of erratic and uncharacteristic financial decisions. Pursuant to protecting the assets of the estate and ensuring your proper care.
My vision blurred. I had to read the final line twice for the meaning to sink in. We hereby petition the court for the emergency appointment of a temporary conservator to manage your financial and personal affairs. I let the paper fall from my numb fingers. It fluttered to the tabletop. A conservator? Carol snatched the letter, her eyes racing over the words. Her face flushed a deep, furious red. "Those little weasels," she hissed. "They're trying to have you declared incompetent. They want to take control of everything, the house, your accounts, everything." I sank into a chair, the strength gone from my legs. This was so much worse than I had imagined. They weren't just suing for the money. They were trying to strip me of my autonomy, my personhood. They were using my grief as a weapon to make me a prisoner in my own life. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it stole the air from my lungs. They think I've lost my mind," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "No, they don't," Carol said, her voice shaking with rage. "They know you're perfectly sane. This is just the move. This is how you strong-arm a little old lady when she won't hand over her purse." She grabbed the rest of the documents, her lawyerly instincts from her years as a paralegal kicking in. She flipped through the pages, her frown deepening. "They've attached exhibits, bank statements from the trust dissolution, and... Oh, you have got to be kidding me." "What?" I asked, dread a cold stone in my stomach. She held up a printed screenshot. It was a grainy photo, taken from what looked like a security camera or a phone from across the street. It was a picture of me, taken just yesterday, leaving the phone store with Carol. My face was pale, my expression strained. Someone had circled my head in red ink. The caption beneath it read, "Subject appearing disoriented and confused in public, requiring physical assistance from her sister." They were having me followed. They were documenting my every move, twisting normal moments into evidence of madness. The violation was so complete, so intimate, it made me feel physically ill. I thought of Robert's sad performance in the backyard. Had that been a setup? Was someone lurking in the bushes with a camera, waiting to capture my reaction? The world tilted. The kitchen, my safe, familiar kitchen, suddenly felt like a trap. Carol was already on her phone, her finger jabbing at the screen. "Eleanor, it's Carol. They filed a petition for conservatorship. Yes, we just got served. They have pictures, Eleanor. They're following her. I know, just get over here." She hung up and looked at me, her expression a mixture of fury and profound pity. "Eleanor is on her way. She says not to touch anything else. This is now evidence." Evidence. I looked down at my hands, at the simple gold wedding band I still wore. They weren't just coming for my money. They were coming for my life, for my memories, for my very right to be the master of my own destiny. David and I had built this life with calloused hands and hopeful hearts. We had weathered recessions and health scares, all for the dream of a future for our family. And now, the very family we had built it for was using the tools of that world, the lawyers, the courts, the cold, hard logic of money, to tear it all down. I had thought the lowest point was watching them dance on that rooftop. I was wrong. This cold paper and ink attempt to erase me was the true abyss. The envelope sat on the kitchen table like a venomous creature, its contents poisoning the very air in the room. I couldn't look away from that grainy, circled photograph of myself. The woman in the picture seemed small, hunched against an unseen wind, a stranger, even to me. Is that what I had become? A case study in mental decline? A collection of out-of-context moments curated to prove I was no longer fit to run my own life? Carol busied herself making a fresh pot of coffee.
the clatter of the pot and the gurgle of the machine a desperate attempt to fill the silence. "We'll fight this, Nancy," she said, her back to me. "Eleanor will shred this nonsense in court. It's a scare tactic, that's all." But her voice lacked its usual conviction. This was different. This was a direct assault on my fundamental freedom. The doorbell rang. A short, professional burst this time. Eleanor Vance had arrived. She swept into the kitchen, her sharp eyes taking in the scene, the unopened grocery bags, the forgotten coffee, the damning envelope on the table. She didn't bother with pleasantries. She picked up the petition and began to read, her face an impassive mask. She read it twice, then set it down with a soft sigh. "It's aggressive," she stated, "and expensive. They've hired Dennis Albright. He's known for this kind of hardball litigation. He'll drag this out, run up your legal bills, and hope you collapse from the stress and financial pressure before it ever gets to a judge." She tapped the photograph with a perfectly manicured nail. "The surveillance is particularly ugly, but not illegal, if conducted from a public street. They are building a narrative, and we must build a better one. Quickly." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a file. "This is the letter I sent them yesterday, formally cutting off communication. Their filing of this petition today is a direct response to that. They know the money is gone, so they are pivoting to seize control of the remaining assets. This house, your personal accounts, everything. If a conservator is appointed, you would need to ask permission to spend your own money, to sell a piece of furniture, to even make major medical decisions." A cold dread, colder than anything I had felt yet, seeped into my bones. This was about more than money. It was about my liberty. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice a thin thread of sound. "We fight," Eleanor said, her gaze steady on mine. "And we fight dirty if we have to. We need to prove not only that you are competent, but that their petition is brought in bad faith. We need to demonstrate their motive is pure greed, not concern for your welfare." She leaned forward. "Nancy, this is going to get personal. I need to ask you questions you won't want to answer. I need to know about your relationship with your sons before David died. Were there tensions? Money problems? Any history of them being manipulative or entitled?" I felt a hot flush of shame. How do you admit out loud to a virtual stranger that the children you raised are capable of this? I looked at Carol, who gave me a small, encouraging nod. "They were always a little distant," I began, the words feeling like a betrayal. "Especially after they moved away. The phone calls got shorter, visits were rushed. They always seemed impatient with us, with our quiet life. David used to say it was like they were waiting for us to finish being their parents." I told her about the loans, the investments in Michael's various business schemes that never seemed to pan out, the way Robert always managed to have an emergency right around tax time that required a little help from Dad. I had always brushed it off. They were our boys. That's what you do. "And their relationship with their father?" Eleanor pressed, her pen poised over a legal pad. A fresh wave of grief washed over me. "They loved him," I whispered. "But I think they loved the idea of him more than the reality. They loved the successful accountant, the man who could fix their problems. They didn't have much time for the man who wanted to talk about his rose bushes or tell the same old stories about their childhood." I saw the pieces clicking into place behind Eleanor's eyes. She was building our defense, and it was being constructed from the shattered fragments of my family. "Good," she said, and the word felt like a desecration. "This helps. It establishes a pattern of financial expectation. Now, we need to go on the offensive. We have Dr. Evans's report. That's our first piece of evidence. Our next step is to subpoena their financial records. We need to show the court that their sudden, deep concern for your well-being coincides perfectly with their access to your bank accounts being cut off." She stood up, gathering the papers. "I'll file our response tomorrow. It will be a motion to dismiss the petition and a counterclaim for abuse of process. We will be accusing them of maliciously using the court system to harass you." The terminology was dizzying. Motions, counterclaims, subpoenas. My quiet life had been invaded by a language I never wanted to learn. After Eleanor left, armed with my painful confessions and a new battle plan, the house felt even emptier. Carol tried to distract me by finally making the lasagna, the rich smell of garlic and tomatoes filling the air, but it couldn't penetrate the chill that had settled in my soul. I walked into the living room and stopped before the large family portrait taking on our 30th anniversary. We were all there, smiling, a perfect, happy tableau. I looked at David's face, at the pride in his eyes as he looked at his sons. What would he think of this? Would he be horrified by their actions? Or would he be disappointed in me for provoking them, for not keeping the peace, for dismantling the legacy he worked so hard to build? I didn't know anymore. The man I had shared my life with was gone, and he had taken the answers with him. All I had left were the questions, and the two adversaries who used to call me Mom.
The rich, comforting aroma of Carol's lasagna could not penetrate the chill that had settled deep in my bones. I moved through the rooms of my own house like a ghost, the weight of the legal petition a tangible presence on my shoulders. Eleanor's words echoed in the silence. Abuse of process, counterclaim, subpoena. This was no longer my home. It was the central piece of evidence in a bitter, ugly war. I found myself standing in the doorway of David's study, a room I had largely avoided since his death. It was exactly as he had left it. The large oak desk was tidy, his favorite pen sitting perpendicular to a stack of neatly filed papers. The air still held a faint trace of his pipe tobacco, a scent that was fading a little more each day. A slow, quiet second death. This was his sanctuary, the place where he'd balanced our checkbooks, planned for our retirement, and, I now knew, secretly worried about our sons. I walked to the desk and ran my fingers over its smooth, worn surface. My eyes fell on the bottom drawer on the right-hand side, the one he always kept locked. He'd called it his mad money drawer, a joke between us. The key, I knew, was taped to the underside of the middle drawer, a habit from a time when we worried about toddlers getting into things. With trembling fingers, I retrieved the small brass key and fitted it into the lock. It turned with a soft, well-oiled click. I pulled the drawer open. There were no stacks of cash inside. Instead, there was a single, thick, marbled composition notebook, the kind he'd always used for his accounting work. I lifted it out, its weight surprising me. I opened it. The first page wasn't filled with numbers. It was dated from over a year ago, and it was written in David's distinct, precise cursive. Nancy is at the store. The house is too quiet. I find myself thinking about the boys more and more. Michael called again today. Another opportunity. I told him no. The silence on the other end of the line was heavier than any "Okay, Dad," he could have muttered. I fear we have created monsters of entitlement, and I do not know how to tame them. My breath caught in my throat. I sank into his leather desk chair, the notebook feeling like a live thing in my hands. I turned the page. Entry after entry, a secret chronicle of a father's heartbreak. He wrote about Robert's constant complaints about his job, his lack of ambition, his expectation that a solution would always be provided for him. He wrote about the tension during their last visit, how Michael had made a snide comment about the house being a lot for you two to manage, a not-so-subtle probe about downsizing and freeing up equity. He detailed every loan, every gift, every time he felt the sharp sting of their ingratitude. And then my eyes fell on an entry from just 2 months before he died. Spoke with Frank Henderson today about updating the will. He asked the standard questions, including if we had any concerns about the boy's ability to manage a large inheritance. Nancy would have my head if she knew I said this, but I told him yes. I have profound concerns. They see our life's work as a prize to be won, not a legacy to be honored. I told Frank I want to add a clause, a stipulation, that the funds are to be released not on my death, but upon a showing of genuine, sustained responsibility and respect for their mother.
Frank said it was unusual, but he'd draft something. I haven't told Nancy. It would break her heart to know I feel this way about our own sons. But I have to protect her. I have to protect us. A sob tore from my throat, a raw, guttural sound that shattered the study's sacred silence. He knew. David knew. He saw the same cracks I had refused to acknowledge, and he had tried to build a shield for me, a final, posthumous protection. He had died before Frank could draft the new will. The old one, the one that left everything to me with the boys as beneficiaries of the trust, was still in effect. The trust I had dissolved. I clutched the notebook to my chest, tears streaming down my face, dripping onto the worn leather of the chair. It wasn't just my anger and my grief that justified my actions. It was his. It was our shared, silent understanding, spoken only in the privacy of this journal. He had given me his blessing, not in words, but in worry. In this secret, sorrowful record, he had handed me the moral ammunition that I didn't know I needed. I wasn't a vengeful widow lashing out. I was a wife carrying out her husband's last, unspoken wish. I was protecting us, just as he had wanted. The guilt that had been gnawing at the edges of my resolve evaporated, replaced by a solid, unshakable certainty. I took the notebook and I walked back to the kitchen, where Carol was setting the table. She took one look at my tear-streaked face and the book in my hands and froze. "Nancy, what is it?" I placed the notebook on the table, right on top of the legal petition. "It's from David," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in weeks. His journal. He knew Carol. He knew what they were. I watched as she read a few of the entries, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, my dear Lord, this changes everything." "It doesn't change the law," I said, the newfound steel in my voice surprising even me. "But it changes me." I picked up my new phone, the one that held only the numbers of people who loved me, and I called Eleanor Vance. "Eleanor," I said when she answered, the words clear and firm. "You need to come back. I've just found our smoking gun."
The notebook sat between us on the kitchen table, a silent, powerful witness. Eleanor Vance read it with the focused intensity of a surgeon, her eyes scanning David's precise script, occasionally pausing to make a small note on her legal pad. She didn't react emotionally. She was processing evidence, building a case. When she finished, she closed the cover with a soft, definitive thud and looked at me, a new, grim respect in her gaze. "This is compelling," she said. "It won't automatically dismiss their petition, but it completely reframes the narrative. We are no longer just defending your competence. We are now proving that their father shared your concerns and that their actions are a direct validation of the very fears that led you to dissolve the trust." She tapped the journal. "This is proof of their long-standing sense of entitlement and their strained relationship with their parents. A judge will not look kindly on two sons who ignored their father in life and are now attempting to legally incapacitate their mother based on behavior their own father documented." She immediately got on the phone, her voice crisp and authoritative. "Draft a supplemental filing. We're attaching excerpts from the decedent's personal journal as exhibits." Yes, you heard me, a journal. "I'll messenger over the relevant pages within the hour. This goes from a dispute over assets to a case of profound familial bad faith." As she spoke, I felt a shift within me. The crushing weight of isolation lifted. I wasn't alone in this fight. David was with me. His words, his fears, his love were my armor. The shame I had felt, the secret belief that I had somehow failed as a mother, that I had raised these men, melted away, replaced by a grieving solidarity with my husband. We had seen the same truth. We just ran out of time to fix it together. After Eleanor left again, armed with the most potent weapon in our arsenal, Carol and I finally ate the lasagna. It was cold, but I didn't care. For the first time since this nightmare began, I tasted my food. I felt the nourishment.
The fight was far from over, but the debilitating fear was gone. The phone in my pocket, my new phone, remained blessedly silent, but the old one, powered off in the kitchen drawer, seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. They were out there, planning their next move, unaware that the ground had just fundamentally shifted beneath their feet.
Later that evening, as I was washing the dishes, a different kind of sound came from the front of the house. Not a knock, not the doorbell. It was the distinct, gritty scrape of mail being pushed through the brass slot in the door and fluttering to the floor. My heart gave a nervous jump. Carol, who was wiping down the table, froze. "Are you expecting anything?" she asked. "No," I said, drying my hands on a towel. We both walked to the foyer. Lying on the polished hardwood floor was not a bill or a catalog. It was a single, linen-textured envelope, handwritten in a familiar looping script I hadn't seen in years. It was Robert's handwriting. My name was on the front. No address. It had been hand-delivered. I stared at it, my newfound certainty wavering. A letter. Not a legal document, not a threat shouted through a door. A letter. It felt old-fashioned, personal, dangerous. "Don't," Carol warned, her voice low. "It's a trap, Nancy. It's what Eleanor said. They're trying to get to your soft heart." "I know," I whispered, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. The last time Robert had written me a letter, he was 10 years old, away at summer camp, telling me he missed my pancakes and had named a squirrel after me. This envelope held none of that childish warmth. It felt heavy with intention. I bent down and picked it up. The paper was thick, expensive. I carried it back to the kitchen table, Carol trailing behind me, her anxiety a palpable force. I slid my finger under the flap and tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of matching stationery. I unfolded it. "Mom," it began. The word alone sent a jolt through my system. "I'm writing this because I don't think you'll listen if I try to talk. I know you're angry. I know you think we're monsters. But you have to understand. Seeing that video, it wasn't what it looked like. We were in shock. We didn't know how to process it. Dad was just gone. So we drank. We tried to numb the pain, to pretend for a few hours that the world hadn't just ended. It was a mistake, a stupid, horrible mistake that I will regret for the rest of my life." I could feel Carol reading over my shoulder, her breath on my neck. "But what you're doing? This isn't you, Mom. This is the grief talking. The trust, the money. That was Dad's dream for us. It was his legacy. To just take it away, to give it to strangers, it's like you're erasing him. You're erasing us. Michael is angry, but I'm just sad. I'm so sad. I miss Dad. I miss you. I miss our family. This legal stuff, it's gotten out of hand. Please, can we just talk? Without lawyers, without all this hate? I'm staying at the Fairfield Inn on Elm, room 214. I'll be here all night. Just come and talk to me. Your son, Robert." I let the letter fall from my fingers. It fluttered to the table, landing next to a dried droplet of tomato sauce from our dinner. The silence in the kitchen was thick, charged. Carol was the first to speak. "It's a trap," she said, her voice flat and certain. "Every word is calculated. It wasn't what it looked like. I'm just sad. He's playing on your sympathy, Nancy. He's the wounded bird because Michael, the hawk, didn't work." I knew she was right. Every logical part of me screamed that she was right. This was the good cop routine Eleanor had predicted. But his words, they echoed in the hollow, lonely places of my heart. I miss Dad. I miss you. I miss our family. They were the words I ached to hear. They were the words I had prayed for in the dark of night. And now they were here,
written in his own hand, and they felt like a lifeline thrown into a stormy sea. I looked at Carol, my eyes filled with a conflict that was tearing me apart. "What if he means it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What if just for a moment he means it?"
The silence in the kitchen was a physical weight, pressing in on me from all sides. Carol's face was a mask of fierce, protective skepticism. The letter lay between us. Robert's pleading words a stark contrast to the cold legal petition that had arrived just hours before. Two versions of my son, and I had no idea which one was real. "Nancy, listen to me," Carol said, her voice low and urgent. "He didn't write, 'I'm sorry for the pain we caused you.' He wrote, 'It wasn't what it looked like.' He's not apologizing for his actions, he's justifying them. He's not regretting his behavior, he's regretting the consequences." I knew she was parroting Eleanor's playbook, and it was a good playbook. It was smart. It was safe. But it didn't account for the raw, desperate hope now clawing at my insides. The hope that one of them, just one, might actually be the boy I remembered. "What if this is the crack, Carol?" I pleaded, my voice trembling. "What if this is the opening? If I slam the door in his face now, if I treat his attempt, however flawed, with the same coldness they've shown me, then what does that make me? Then we're all just lost." I looked at the clock. It was just past 8. The Fairfield Inn was a 20-minute drive. "I have to go." Carol's shoulders slumped in defeat. "Then I'm driving you, and I'm waiting in the car, and you have your phone in your hand, and if anything, and I mean anything, feels wrong, you text me a single X and I am calling the police and bursting through that door myself." I didn't argue. Her presence was the only thing making this feel less like a catastrophic mistake. The drive was a silent, tense journey through the familiar streets of my town, a place that now felt like the setting for a foreign and terrifying film. Carol pulled into the parking lot of the motel, a bland, 2-story building with flickering fluorescent lights. She put the car in park but left the engine running. "Room 214, she said, pointing to a second-floor door with a rusting metal balcony in front of it. "I'll be right here." I got out, the cool night air doing little to clear the frantic buzzing in my head. Each step up the concrete staircase felt like a mile. The industrial carpet in the hallway smelled of stale cigarette smoke and disinfectant. I stood before room 214, my heart hammering against my ribs. I could see the flickering blue light of a television through the gap in the curtains. I raised my hand and knocked, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet corridor. The door opened almost immediately, as if he'd been standing right behind it, waiting. Robert stood there, dressed in a faded college sweatshirt and jeans. He looked younger, more vulnerable than he had on the porch. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face pale. "Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He stepped aside, and I walked into the room. It was a standard, soulless motel room, a large bed, a cheap laminate desk, a TV bolted to the wall. The air was thick with the smell of takeout food. He closed the door, and the click of the lock sent a jolt of primal fear through me. I was alone with him. "You came," he said, and a single tear traced a path down his cheek. It undid me. That tear, so raw and seemingly genuine, shattered all my defenses. "Oh, Robert," I breathed, and the distance between us collapsed. I opened my arms, and he fell into them, his body shaking with sobs. He buried his face in my shoulder, just as he had when he was a little boy who'd skin his knee. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry," he choked out, his words muffled by my coat. "It's been so awful. Everything has been so awful." I held him, stroking his hair, my own tears falling freely. This was my baby. This was the child I had rocked to sleep, whose fevered brow I had cooled. In that moment, all the anger, the betrayal, the legal documents, it all melted away in the face of this primal, maternal connection. We stood like that for a long time, clinging to each other in the dim, impersonal room. When his sobs finally subsided, he led me to sit on the edge of the bed. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, looking utterly spent. "Michael,
He's just so angry, Robert said, his voice hoarse. He feels like Dad's legacy is being stolen from him. But I don't care about the money, Mom. I really don't. I can't lose you, too. He looked at me, his eyes pleading. Can we just stop this, please? Can you just call off your lawyer? We can be a family again. We can figure this out, together. It was everything I had wanted to hear. It was the balm my shattered soul had been craving. The word yes was on my lips, a desperate, hopeful yes that wanted to believe in this fairy tale ending. But then, my eyes, drifting over his shoulder, caught something on the cheap nightstand. Next to a half-eaten container of lo mein was his phone. It wasn't lying flat. It was propped up against a motel notepad, the screen facing directly towards us. And on that screen, I saw a tiny, glowing red dot. A recording indicator. The world froze. The sound of his sobs, the feel of his embrace, the heartfelt plea, it all curdled in an instant. The tear, the vulnerability, the perfect scripted performance. It was all for this. He wasn't trying to reconcile, he was trying to gather evidence. He was recording his emotionally fragile mother, hoping to capture her saying she didn't care about the money, that she would call off the lawyer, that she was acting out of grief, anything they could use against me in court. The coldness of the calculation was so absolute, so profound, it stole the air from my lungs. I looked from the phone back to his face. He saw that I had seen it. The pleading in his eyes vanished, replaced for a split second by a flash of panicked guilt before it shuddered into a defensive blankness. I stood up. My legs felt like they were made of wood. I didn't say a word. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just walked to the door, unlocked it, and stepped out into the hallway. I closed the door softly behind me, leaving my son and the shattered remains of my hope in that stale, rented room. I walked down the stairs, each step mechanical, my body moving on autopilot of sheer survival. I opened the car door and slid into the passenger seat. Carol took one look at my face, at the utter, barren emptiness in my eyes, and she knew. Oh, honey. I looked straight ahead, through the windshield, at the blinking motel sign. He was recording me. I said, my voice a flat, dead thing. Drive. Just drive.
Carol didn't speak. She simply put the car in gear and pulled out of the motel parking lot, the tires crunching over the gravel. She drove aimlessly for a while, through quiet suburban streets where families were settling in for the night, their lives still whole and intact behind glowing windows. The silence in the car was a shroud, thick and suffocating. The image of that tiny red dot was burned onto my retinas, a searing brand of ultimate betrayal. He hadn't just rejected me, he had weaponized my love for him. He had used my deepest, most vulnerable longing for reconciliation as a trap. The pain was no longer a sharp, screaming thing. It was a vast, silent, airless void. There was nothing left. No anger, no hope, no love. Just a hollow, echoing nothingness. When Carol finally spoke, her voice was soft, careful, as if afraid I might shatter. What do you want to do? I continued to stare out the window, watching the streetlights blur into streaks of orange. I want to go home, I said. The word felt different now. It wasn't a sanctuary anymore, it was a fortress, and I was its sole defender. And then I want you to call Eleanor. Tell her what happened. When we got back, the house felt different. The fight was no longer an external force knocking at the door. It had seeped inside, into the very plaster and bones of the place. It was in the air I breathed. Carol made the call to Eleanor, her voice tight with a controlled fury, as she relayed the events at the motel. I sat in David's armchair, not crying,
not moving, just existing in the aftermath. The notebook was still on the coffee table. I picked it up, holding its weight in my hands. David had tried to warn me. In his own quiet way, he had left me a map of the battlefield. I had just needed to walk through the fire myself to believe it. The next morning, Eleanor arrived, her demeanor more grimly satisfied than I had ever seen her. "It's despicable," she said, placing her briefcase on the table, "but it's also a gift. A failed attempt to entrap you is a powerful demonstration of their bad faith. We will include it in our filings. A sworn affidavit from you detailing the entire event." She looked at me, her head tilted. "Are you prepared to do that, Nancy? To put it all down on paper, under oath?" I met her gaze. The hollowness of the night before had been filled, not with softness, but with a core of hardened steel. "Yes," I said.
There was no hesitation. The mother they had known was gone. She had died in that motel room, faced with the cold, unblinking eye of her son's phone. What was left was something else entirely. I spent the next 2 hours with Eleanor, dictating a detailed account of the meeting, the letter, the tears, the embrace, and the final, chilling discovery of the recording. I signed the affidavit with a hand that did not shake. As Eleanor was gathering her papers to leave, a new thought occurred to me, cold and clear. "Eleanor, wait." She paused. "The trust money I donated to the community college, is there any way they could challenge that? Try to get it back?" She considered it. "It's possible they could try to sue the college, arguing the transfer was made under duress or without mental capacity. It would be a long shot, but it would create a headache for them and tie up the funds." "I want to make it impossible," I said, my voice firm. "I want to add a condition. I want it stipulated that the endowment is to be used specifically for a scholarship in David's name, for single parents returning to school." It was the one thing David had always believed in, the dignity of hard work, the power of a second chance. It was the antithesis of everything our sons had become. A slow smile spread across Eleanor's face. "That," she said, "is brilliant. It memorializes your husband in a way that is meaningful and makes the funds virtually untouchable. I'll have the paperwork drawn up immediately." After she left, I didn't sink into the chair. I didn't stare at the walls. I walked to the hall closet and pulled out a large cardboard box. I carried it into the living room and began to work. I started with the photographs on the mantel. I took down the wedding portrait, the family vacations, the graduations. I didn't look at them. I simply placed them, carefully, face down, in the box. One by one, I cleared the surfaces of my home of their images. The ceramic handprint Robert made in kindergarten, the Little League trophy Michael was so proud of. All of it went into the box. It wasn't an act of rage. It was an act of archaeology. I was carefully, methodically excavating my life from the rubble of their betrayal. I was not erasing them. I was simply packing them away, storing the artifacts of a civilization that had collapsed. Carol watched me from the doorway, her eyes filled with a sad understanding. She didn't offer to help. She knew this was something I had to do alone. When the living room was clear, I sealed the box with packing tape. I carried it down to the basement and placed it on a high, dusty shelf next to the Christmas decorations. I didn't know if I would ever open it again. I climbed the stairs, closed the basement door behind me, and walked back into the living room. The room looked larger, lighter. The afternoon sun streamed in, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The spaces on the walls and tables were not empty. They were full of potential. They were waiting for a new story to be written. I stood in the center of the room, breathing in the quiet. The war was not over. The court date loomed, but the battle within me was finished. I had faced the worst of it, and I was still standing. I was Nancy Miller, widow,
mother, and now a woman who was finally, unequivocally, free.
The silence in the newly cleared living room was not an absence, but a presence. It was a clean, open space where the air could move freely, no longer crowded with the ghosts of a life that had curdled into something painful and false. I stood in the center of it for a long time, just breathing, feeling the solid floor beneath my feet, the steady, resilient beat of my own heart. Carol had left, giving me a long, wordless hug at the door, her own eyes shining with a mix of sorrow and pride. She understood that this was a threshold I needed to cross alone. The fight was now a cold, professional matter for the lawyers. The emotional war was over. I had surrendered the hope of reconciliation, and in that surrender, I had found a strength I never knew I possessed. A few days later, a formal notice arrived from the court. The hearing for the conservatorship petition was scheduled for 3 weeks hence. Eleanor called, her voice crisp and businesslike. "They've received our supplemental filing, including the journal excerpts and the affidavit about the motel incident. Their lawyer, Albright, is furious. He knows his case just became exponentially more difficult. He has requested a private mediation session before we see the judge." "Mediation?" I asked, the term feeling foreign. "It's a closed-door meeting with a neutral third party to see if we can settle without a public, expensive trial. They are feeling the pressure, Nancy. They want to see if they can salvage something before a judge eviscerates them in open court." I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. What should I do? "You should attend," Eleanor said, "but you go in with absolute resolve. The only thing on the table for discussion is a formal, legally binding agreement where they drop the petition with prejudice, meaning they can never file it again, and agreed to a no-contact order for a period of at least 5 years. There will be no discussion of money. The money is gone. This is about protecting your peace." The idea of being in the same room with them made my skin crawl, but I agreed. It felt like the final, necessary exorcism. The mediation was held in a bland beige conference room in a downtown office building. Eleanor and I arrived first. I wore a simple, dark blue dress, my back straight, my hands clasped calmly in my lap. I was no longer a grieving widow. I was a plaintiff. When the door opened and Michael and Robert walked in with their lawyer, Dennis Albright, a tall, florid man with a combative stance, the air in the room changed. They wouldn't look at me. They took seats on the far side of the long table, their postures stiff. Robert looked at the tabletop, his shoulders hunched. Michael stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek. The mediator, a calm, older woman named Patricia, began by outlining the process. Then she turned to Albright. "Mr. Albright, your clients have petitioned the court based on concerns for Mrs. Miller's welfare. Given the evidence submitted, what is your client's current position?" Albright cleared his throat. "My clients remain deeply concerned. However, in the interest of avoiding a protracted family conflict, they are willing to withdraw the petition in exchange for the reinstatement of their rightful inheritance." Eleanor didn't even let the words finish hanging in the air. "No," she said, her voice like a sliver of ice. "The petition will be withdrawn with prejudice, and my client will agree to a mutual no-contact order for a period of 5 years. That is the only offer. There is no negotiation on financial matters." Michael finally looked at me, his eyes blazing with a hatred so pure it was almost fascinating. "So that's it?" he spat, ignoring the mediator entirely. "You steal from your own sons and you hide behind a lawyer? You're not our mother. You're a thief." The words should have hurt. A month ago, they would have destroyed me. Now they just sounded pathetic, the last desperate thrashing of a trapped animal. I met his gaze, my own steady and calm. I said nothing. My silence was more powerful than any retort. It was Eleanor who spoke. "My client is under no obligation to fund the lifestyles of 2 grown men who showed her and their late father such profound disrespect. The only thing being stolen here, Mr. Miller, is your mother's peace, and that ends today." The mediation went on for another hour.
a tedious back and forth of legal posturing. Albright blustered about undue influence and testamentary capacity, but the wind had gone out of his sails. The journal and the recording attempt had crippled their case. They had nothing left but empty threats. Finally, faced with the certain prospect of a humiliating public loss and a judge potentially ordering them to pay my legal fees, they capitulated. They agreed to drop the petition with prejudice. They agreed to the 5-year no-contact order. They signed the papers right there, their signature is an angry, slashing scrawl. As we stood to leave, Robert finally looked up at me. His face was a mess of conflicting emotions: shame, anger, and a flicker of what might have been loss. Our eyes met. For a single suspended moment, there were no words left. There was nothing left to say. I turned and walked out of the room with Eleanor, the door closing softly behind us, sealing the silence. It was over. The legal battle was won. But as we rode the elevator down in silence, I felt no sense of victory. There was no triumph in the ashes of your own family. There was only the quiet, solemn responsibility of moving forward, of building a new life from the rubble. Eleanor left me at my car with a firm handshake and a promise to send the final, filed documents. I drove home alone, the late afternoon sun casting long, golden shadows across the road. I pulled into my driveway, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment looking at the house. It was just a house again. Not a fortress, not a museum, not a crime scene. It was my house. I went inside, and the emptiness I had created was still there, but it no longer felt barren. It felt full of potential. I walked to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and put it on the stove. I took a single mug from the cupboard. The whistle of the kettle was a cheerful, ordinary sound. I poured the steaming water over a tea bag and carried the mug into the living room. I sat in David's armchair, not as an escape, but as a comfort. I looked out the window at the garden, at the rose bushes we had planted together. They were dormant now, their branches bare and brown, waiting for the spring. I took a sip of my tea. It was hot and strong. And for the first time since the call came on that golden Tuesday, I felt a sense of peace, not as an absence of pain, but as a presence of self. I was here, I was whole, and I was ready to see what came next.